Tonight, stunning news from Russia. Vladimir Putin's main critic reported dead.
Alexey Navalny, the most prominent figure of the Russian opposition and a vocal critic of Vladimir Putin, is dead. He was killed in a penal colony way behind the Arctic Circle, either directly or indirectly as a result of the harsh conditions that he had been subjected to. He was killed because Putin considered him a serious threat to the regime. And today we explain why that was the case and what Navalny's death means for the Russian opposition. Today's video is going to be a little different though. As you know, Prague Pulse has until now been mainly focused on events in the heart of Europe, not Russia specifically. But today we're going to make an exception. You see, developments in Russia certainly do have serious ramifications for the entire continent. For one, most of the countries that I am primarily focused on this channel directly border Russia, or Belarus, which has now basically become a puppet state of Russia. Without a doubt, the death of Russia's opposition leader is a seismic event for Russia and hence the region. Plus, the countries in the heart of Europe that are the main focus of this channel are also, coincidentally, the biggest recipients of refugees fleeing Putin's brutal war of aggression against Ukraine that continues, sadly, until this day. So, those countries do feel the ramifications of Russia's actions in more ways than one. Before we begin, a word of warning here. As is often the case with violent acts committed by the Kremlin, there are definitely going to be attempts to dilute the information space related to Navalny, either by the regime itself or its proponents. You are likely going to hear that Navalny's death was only an accident, that the West is to blame, or that the Kremlin actually had no motives to kill Navalny. And that is also why I decided to make this video. Naturally, this video is by no means an exhaustive explanation of Russia's society or Alexey Navalny's role in it. The topic is so incredibly complex that it is being studied around the world for years and years. I myself studied Russian politics, and while I do have a solid understanding of what is going on, there is always so much more to learn. A 10-minute video will hardly cover everything there is to say. But I do hope that I at least help you understand the tactics that the Kremlin uses to dilute the truth, and I'll help you understand what Navalny's loss means for Russia. And I'll of course also hope that I could even motivate you to study the topic further, for instance by referring to the resources mentioned in the description of this video. Without further ado, let's dive in. While Vladimir Putin's grip on power has been tightening immensely in recent years, it's not that long ago that civil society was actually flourishing in the country, by Russian standards at least. To understand why and how, look back at 2008. That was the year when Putin had to officially step back from the presidency due to constitutional term limits that were still in place at that time. He chose a figurehead to replace him momentarily, Dmitry Medvedev, and became prime minister instead. Medvedev was certainly by no means a reformer, but he at least appeared to rule Russia in a more relaxed and liberal manner than Putin. He talked of his love for rock music, he complained about the lack of judicial independence in Russia, and even excitedly spoke about the possibilities of the internet. He himself was actively tweeting and blogging. To give you the contrast, just consider this. Putin reportedly does not know how to use the internet at all. Medvedev's more liberal attitude, coupled with growing prosperity in Russia, which was mainly caused by high oil prices at that time, gave rise to something resembling a civil society. Groupings were formed to, for instance, protest against government officials who often flouted traffic laws. Environmental protection groups were established. But the era of liberty wasn't meant to last long. Although some claim that Medvedev actually aspired to a second term in office, Putin had other ideas. You see, Putin had been merely forced to step back by the constitutional limits. He didn't really want to leave the presidency in the first place. And so, in 2011, when Medvedev's first and only term was about to expire, Putin summoned Medvedev to a fishing expedition, yes, you heard me, and there he announced to him that he would actually be returning to the Kremlin and that Medvedev would need to pack up. This time, unsurprisingly, Putin had no intention whatsoever of leaving office ever again, and that was why he engaged in systematic voter fraud. A few times, official cameras at polling stations even recorded officials stuffing ballot boxes with extra votes for Putin and his United Russia party. This sparked massive protests from the newly energized Russian elite.
Очевидна махинация, очевидно это жульничество. Причем оно было сделано настолько уверен, что выйдет миллион.
Tens of thousands of people took to the streets. Chants like "Russia without Putin" were commonplace. Before we continue, let me know in the comments whether or not you'd like to see more Russia-focused content in the future. And to make sure that you don't miss it, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now back to the video. Putin did survive the protests in the end, mainly by significantly tightening his grip on power, which also included abolishing term limits completely. However, the galvanizing atmosphere of the protests enabled Alexey Navalny's rise to prominence. At first, Navalny won the attention of the masses as an anti-corruption blogger, exposing cases of corruption in Putin's inner circle. That's also why the regime started to perceive him as a threat quite quickly. You see, the main problem wasn't that Navalny uncovered corruption as such. What really bothered the regime was that Navalny exposed that the very highest echelons of power are corrupt as well, including Putin himself. You see, Putin had attempted to portray himself as a brave fighter against corruption, not a beneficiary of it. And yet, there was Navalny who showed to the Russian public a multi-million-dollar luxury mansion that he claimed belonged to Putin himself.
Самый секретный дворец в России. Дворец Путина под Геленджиком. Владимир Путин мнит себя русским императором и ведет себя соответствующе.
While at the same time, the Russian president only officially makes around 100,000 euros a year. So clearly, the money to build the mansion must have come from corruption. To make matters worse for the regime, polling done by the Levada Center later found that 80% of the Russian population actually believed that the allegation made by Navalny were true. With that, Navalny had become a serious threat to Putin's survival, both figuratively and maybe even quite literally, and so he needed to be silenced somehow. The Kremlin has tried different methods to shut Navalny up. Initially, some thought that he could even be allowed to serve as a valve for dissatisfied voters, essentially that he would be allowed to run in certain elections to create the illusion of an anti-Putin opposition, while in fact, the regime would tightly control his performance and make sure that he doesn't win any real power. After all, inventing fake political parties is nothing new in Russia. But then Navalny achieved a surprisingly good performance in the 2013 vote for Moscow's mayor. The result was so good that not even the regime was able to hide it completely. Just consider this. According to official results released by the regime, Navalny gained over 27% of the vote. But of course, conveniently, Navalny's opponent, a Putin ally, reportedly scored just enough votes to avoid a runoff election. Unsurprisingly, this again led to accusations of fraud. But even the officially admitted results were basically an admission by the regime that Navalny had now become a force to be reckoned with. What we need to realize is that Navalny was not just an activist. The Kremlin was mainly afraid of him because he behaved like a true politician. He didn't just talk about democracy and lofty ideals, he built a genuine grassroots movement. Headquarters of his campaign were built up around the country, and he was intent on challenging Putin in the 2018 presidential election.
Я лучше Путина, потому что хочу освободить вас от этого и сэкономить ваши деньги.
Naturally, he wasn't allowed to run in the end, but he still garnered significant support throughout Russia. Navalny simply wasn't willing to give up that easily. And so, after numerous failed attempts to intimidate him and silence him, Russian agents tried to poison Navalny with the Novichok nerve agent in 2020. Against all odds, as you probably know, Navalny did manage to survive and was later allowed to leave Russia and undergo treatment in Germany. Still, he refused to give up, and later he voluntarily returned to Russia, knowing full well that he would be arrested on arrival, which of course happened, and Navalny unsurprisingly did not leave prison ever again.
The voice of Russia's opposition silenced and on life support after drinking a cup of tea his allies suspect was poisoned. Alexey Navalny became desperately ill aboard a flight forced to make an emergency landing. Groaning can be heard in this unconfirmed cell phone video. Navalny has gained widespread support as an anti-corruption activist with powerful enemies, none more so than Russian President Vladimir Putin, notorious for allegedly using radioactive nerve agents to target double agents, defectors, and others who fall afoul of the Kremlin. Navalny once warned the odds of him winding up dead were high.
So wait a second. Why exactly did Navalny come back to Russia given that he knew what would happen to him? Well, it seems that he really was intent on taking on the regime, and he understood the consequences quite well. Upon arrival, Navalny was given an 11-year sentence for trumped-up charges of fraud and embezzlement. In 2023, another 19 years was added to his sentence. Effectively, this meant that Navalny was about to spend the rest of his life in prison, and he knew it. Needless to say, the places where the Putin regime jails its opponents are not exactly pretty. Quite the contrary. Navalny spent the last days before his death in a penal colony way behind the Arctic Circle, in what is dubbed one of the harshest prisons in the world. Temperatures in the area routinely reach less than -20 degrees Celsius. Inmates have described being made to stand outside in the winter without coats. Those who fail to stand still face being doused with cold water. Snow is later replaced by mud when temperatures rise above freezing around May. In the summer, prisoners are forced to strip to their waists in swarms of mosquitoes. And with summer comes long days with no nights, because we're behind the Arctic Circle. It all takes a heavy physical toll on the inmates. A few days ago, in February 2024, it was reported that Navalny had died.
Navalny will personally call his poisoners one by one.
Это Навальный, Алексей, вас беспокоит. Хотел узнать, зачем вы хотели меня убить.
Oh my god, you ruined their day.
Now the question is, did Putin have him killed? Well, probably not directly, but it was certainly a result of the inhumane conditions that he had been subjected to on Putin's orders. The background that I've just gone through is instrumental to estimate what may happen now that Navalny is gone. It shows us where he possibly made mistakes and what the opposition now needs to do differently to have any chance of succeeding. First, it must bring a viable alternative to Putin's regime. You see, Navalny was great at exposing the hypocrisy of the regime, and he did have some supporters throughout the country, sure. But there has never really been a truly significant opposition force that would really offer an attractive alternative to Putin. Whether we like it or not, the vast majority of the Russian population still seems to favor the stability that Putin embodies in their eyes. If the opposition is ever to succeed in Russia, it must formulate clearly what a future without Putin would look like, and it has to convince the population that future will be a better one. And unfortunately, appealing to ideals such as democracy is not enough in Russia. Neither is claiming that without Putin, Russia will simply resemble the West more. If anything, a significant portion of the Russian population now despises the West and doesn't want to look anything like it. Closely tied to that is a second shortcoming that Navalny faced, and that was his unwillingness to form coalitions. You see, his team routinely dismissed attempts of other opposition politicians to unite, saying that the time spent managing alliances is actually better spent directly confronting Putin. In a country as massive as Russia, uniting may actually be a must to appeal to as broad an audience as is necessary. Third, the West needs to clearly denounce Putin's regime and any future pretense of democracy in Russia. After the last presidential pseudo-election in 2018, leaders of the West, including then US President Donald Trump or European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker, presidents of France and Germany, congratulated Putin on his win. That was well after the Kremlin illegally seized Crimea, after it had started a war in the east of Ukraine, after it had killed another regime critic, Boris Nemtsov, and after it had stolen numerous elections. We knew back then what the Russian regime was like, but we chose to do nothing and overlooked it. This must change. The West must clearly show it doesn't consider Putin a legitimate leader of Russia. That, in turn, can motivate and embolden the Russian opposition to unite and stand up to Putin. Let's be brutally honest here. The prospects of the Russian opposition do not look great, at least not in the immediate future. The illegal and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine by Putin has shored up his popularity, just as was the case after the annexation of Crimea 10 years ago. And although the regime routinely lies, kills, and commits fraud, it certainly still has many genuine supporters. Whatever the opposition offers must be seen as a better deal for the average Russians, for them to even consider changing their allegiances. If official Russian data is anything to go by, 85% of the population still approves of Vladimir Putin. Even if we deduct 20% from that, just to be on the safe side, Putin is still all but certain to win yet another presidential pseudo-election that is coming up in March 2024. So the opposition seems to be facing an uphill battle indeed. What's also not at all clear is who could take up Navalny's role as opposition leader, and whether they stand any chance of overcoming the obstacles that we just outlined. Many opposition politicians, such as Vladimir Kara-Murza, former advisor to the murdered Boris Nemtsov, are still in prison today. Organizations such as Open Russia, which aim to build up the Russian civil society, have been banned. Boris Nadezhdin, who wanted to challenge Putin in the upcoming pseudo-election, was barred from even running for fabricated procedural reasons, just as was the case with Navalny himself in 2018. And many others understandably fear any sort of public engagement. In fact, Yulia Navalnaya, Alexey Navalny's widow, now appears to be the most serious contender to Putin. She has already announced that she would continue her husband's endeavors.
Мы знаем, из-за чего конкретно Путин убил Алексея 3 дня назад. Мы скоро вам об этом расскажем. мы обязательно узнаем и то, кто именно и как именно исполнил это преступление. Мы назовем фамилии и покажем лица. Я буду продолжать дело Алексея Навального, продолжать бороться за нашу с вами страну, и я призываю вас встать рядом со мной.
Luckily for her, she is in exile, which means that the Kremlin cannot silence her so easily. However, whether or not she can succeed is still not clear and depends on the factors that I've just outlined. Lastly, together with the other factors, the outcome of the Russian war against Ukraine, which sadly is still ongoing, will also have a significant impact on the future of the Russian opposition and on the future of Putin himself. And of course, it will also impact the countries in the heart of Europe that this channel is primarily focused on. We will be watching that development closely and of course will take you along for the ride. This has been Jan with Proc Pulse. See you next time.